OCI, Orange County Inspection, is glad to present the Quality Control, Quality Assurance Professional Seminar, segment number 4. We will cover the second rule of the project flowchart, codes. In this segment, the topics that we'll take a closer look at are the basics of the code. Here we will look at helpful how-to for items such as knowing when information has been added or deleted from a new code cycle, plus understanding some key abbreviations and symbols that you will see in these situations. Next, we enter into the California Building Codes, the CBCs, first looking at what makes up the entire set of CBCs, and then review key points of Chapter 17 and 22 for the QC and QA professionals. Then we take an interesting look at a document that is being used on projects that are governed by the federal government. The FEMA 353 is a critical specification for the QC and QA professionals. Let's start with the basic information when it comes to a code. What is a code, and why do we need them? First, the purpose of the code is to establish the minimum requirements to public safeguard. Remember, the code is the minimum, so even if the approved specifications or drawings show less than the code, we could never be less than the minimum. Okay, then the scope of the code is to be applied to any type of construction that is being used in the state of California. Now, the same will be followed in any state throughout the United States you may be located in right now. The next question is, how many codes are there? There are thousands of codes for every application of construction. With this segment, we will take a closer look at how to understand the symbols and abbreviations used in the California Building Code. Here is a helpful guide that is provided in the California Building Codes, but many don't even know it exists. Let's take a closer look. First, we see the legend of abbreviations that are found throughout the codes. Here is an important abbreviation to know, the State Fire Marshal. Now here's the Division of State Architects, DSA. And finally we see the OSHPD abbreviation. Now we see the symbols that you must know and where you will come across them. The first symbol is the double vertical lines. These lines represent a change within the CBC. Here is where the lines will be found and how they look. Next is the asterisk symbols. A single asterisk symbol indicates the deletion of an entire paragraph, and the triple asterisk symbol indicates the deletion of model code language. To finish the symbols is the crow's foot. This symbol stands for the deletion of California language, and here is how you would find it used in the code. To complete this topic of code basics, let's cover one last tip on how to navigate the code to find the answers you need, and that is the index. Following our theme of welding, we will find two major items with plenty of information for us. We see first under steel, and notice all the reference plus code sections that cover steel. And now we look at welding and also see even more references. So in closing, using the index might not give us the answer right at first, but it will help us with being put in the right area that will lead us to finding the answer we seek. Next topic we will cover is a closer look into the California Building Code. There are two chapters that should be understood by the QC and QA professionals. First, as we said earlier, there is a code for every aspect of the construction industry, from structural to residential phases. Now we will take a closer look at Chapter 17, Structural Tests and Special Inspections. Here we see the sections covered in this chapter. But do you know there is another form of Chapter 17? Notice the A. And what is the difference between these two? The scope supplied by the state is any DSA, aka school structures, will use this special design chapter. Then, structures regulated by OSHPD will also use this chapter. But always stop and read when you see this extra note. It's called exceptions. These will definitely have important information dealing with the section it's written in. Moving through Chapter 17, we come across some key definitions found in Section 1702A. It doesn't matter if you are the QC or the QA side. We hope this seminar will make you aware of the different roles that are involved with fabricating or installing material, and the first personnel is the special inspector. This person is a third-party quality assurance. Their duties are to observe the work being performed both in a shop or the field and report that compliance with the approved specifications and drawings and applicable codes are being met. Early in the seminar, we spoke about the terms of continuous inspection, and here we see the proper definition as per the code. Continuous inspection is basically when the observation of work is full time in the area where the work is being performed. So now, let's see another term you will run across, and that's periodic inspection. Here, the observation is either part-time or intermittent basis in the area of work being performed. Structural observation is simply when a design professional team will observe and report discrepancies found in the shop or field. Usually, in private sector projects, these scheduled visits are established between the design professional and authority having jurisdiction. And in the DSA or OSHPD arena, these will be set as project milestones. Here we look at Section 1704A, Point 3.1, Welding of Chapter 17. This section defines the inspection of welding, and as for the QC professional, if your business includes welding, this will alert you to items that must be followed or you stand a chance of non-compliance. First is, all shop and field welds must be qualified by an approved enforcement agency. Then the inspector themselves must be certified also as per the AWS CWI certification. Here we see if welding of cold form steel, also known as light gauge steel, is performed, it must comply with AWS D1.3. Also, another duty of the welding inspector is verifying the installation of automatic and welded stud shear connectors. Notice here the call out of the welding inspector's duty, which is to report to the design professional team and enforcement agency that the work complies with the approved specifications and drawings and AWS D1.1. And lastly, here is the approval to use one of the means for non-destructive testing to assure the adequacy of the welding. We now review an important table found in Chapter 17 for the QC and QA professionals, and that is Table 1704A.3, Required Verification and Inspection of Steel Construction. Let's break down the key parts in this table to make understanding it less confusing. First, there are vertical columns of information. This column actually calls out the types of inspections and scenarios that will be ran across typically in a shop or the field. We see moving down the left side we have 6 different disciplines. With subdisciplines. Now moving to the column that states either continuous or periodic inspection. If the box reveals a line, that inspection is not required, but if an X is showing, that inspection will be required. Next is the reference standards. And for certain disciplines, there is additional references called out for further information. The last column to the right in the California Building Code reference, which gives the code section that this discipline is discussed further for the information. And lastly, always remember the footnotes to any table or chart. This will provide tremendous amount of information. For the QC professional, here's an important section. The code specifically states the contractor's responsibilities. First, it states each contractor, not just certain ones. Next is a written statement of the responsibilities prior to the start of work, and here are 4 key items that must be followed. Number 1 is a statement of awareness for the required inspections. The second one is that control will be exercised to conform to the required approved documents, drawings, specifications, and code. The third item is written procedures showing how this will be accomplished within the contractor's company. And lastly, the contractor must identify the personnel that will exercise such control. Here's an important piece of code for the mechanical and electrical QC professionals. When a piece of equipment is to be introduced to seismic forces before that can be installed, each manufacturer must have the test results analyzed and accepted by the design professional and approved by the building official. What is the actual test required? A shaker table test. We now move to Chapter 22, Steel. Here, as we saw in Chapter 17, there is 2 different types of chapters for steel. If you are working with DSA or OSHPD, you will need to follow this table of contents, and the A distinguishes the difference. The chapter covers the quality, design, fabrication, and erection of steel used structurally in buildings or structures, and also light gauge steel is also covered. The first thing to understand with using this chapter is that all the answers to the questions that will arise with steel are not found just here. You will need to also use the AWS and ASCE codes and AISC specifications. Once again, we could spend days breaking down each important part found in this chapter alone. But we will only review key items that you need to be alerted to, and one of those are the definition changes with seismic zones. Now, if you are not in California as you participate in this seminar, the word earthquakes probably don't grab your attention as much as the words of tornadoes or hurricanes. But here in California, we have different zones of movement from earthquakes, and in the older codes, the term seismic zones 1, 2, 3, and 4 were used, with 1 being the least and 4 being the most severe. Now in the newer codes, the language has been changed to categories A, B, C, D, E, and F, with A being the least and F being the most severe. And we see here that any structure calculated designs for categories A, B, or C are not allowed with DSA or OSHPD. And with categories D, E, and F, they require specific accordance and approval before any fabrication or installation can take place. In section 2210A, we find the code requirements for cold form steel frame construction. As with any section in the California Building Code, there are 2 different sections, and DA shows the difference. This section covers the design, installation, and construction of light gauge steel, which must be in accordance with the AISI General and NAS sections. Next is the section for design and installation of headers, which must be in accordance with the AISI header section. The third section covers trusses, with the design, assurance, installation, and testing must be in accordance with the AISI truss section. Always remember to slow down and read the entire section, because here we see the engineering analysis and drawings must be submitted for approval by the enforcement agency. We come across wall stud design sections, and it must be in accordance with the AISI WSD section. And lastly, the lateral design sections must be in accordance with the AISI lateral sections. But once again, there is an important note which covers how certain shear wall assemblies are not permitted within a seismic force resisting systems. To finish the California Building Code, we cover section 2212A testing. And once again, we see that there are 2 different types of testing sections found in the California Building Code, which is marked by the A. As we find in the first section, tests of structural steel, all steel shall be identified, and it also covers about what must be done when the steel is not properly identified. Here we see another exception, and remember the major rule: slow down and read it fully. As we review this exception, it states that no testing is required for unidentified steel when the yield strength is less than 25 KSI and it's not part of the resisting system. Next is the section that covers high-strength bolts, nuts, and washers, where it states that these shall be sampled and tested by an approved independent testing laboratory. Now we see the requirements for testing of end welded studs, which should be sampled and tested as per the AWS D11. And as we close this section, the testing of beam to column connections are covered, but look closely that the section starts with when testing is required, and if so, must meet the requirements of AISC 341 Appendix S. The last topic we will cover in this segment 4 is the FEMA 353 document. First, as we look to the right top corner, we see the actual document we are using and what year this was adopted, which was July 2000. There are many different documents that FEMA has drawn up, and you might ask, what is FEMA? Well, it's our federal tax money hard at work, and FEMA stands for Federal Emergency Management Agency. And what is this document about? This is a recommended guideline for the QA professional who was involved with the constructing of steel moment frames for seismic applications. So as we saw in the specifications earlier in the seminar, the FEMA document was called out as one of the requirements to be followed for compliance with the jurisdiction having authority. But this is very important information for the QC professional also to know and understand. Here we start with the table of contents, and as we move down the page we come across the list of figures and tables, which we will review later in this topic. Moving down further is the introduction, which covers the purpose and background of this document. Now we see something very important. There are two different parts to this document, and now we will review part 1. We come across the first chapter that covers the general requirements of the steel category. Next, we review the definitions of both QC and QA professionals. Here, we read the definitions explained for the QA professional, who is not the contractor. Next, we see the QA agency. They are an independent testing organization who is hired by the owner. Now we see the QA plan, which must be part of the contract documents. And here we see the QA plan is required by the code. Next we see the QC definition, which is performed by the contractor. The QC plan must be prepared by the contractor, and once again the QC plan is also required by the code. We move on through the table of contents to Chapter 2, Products, which items like heavy section members and anchor rods are covered. Next is Chapter 3, Execution, where fabrication and erection is detailed. Now, in Chapter 4, Welded joint details, backup bars and weld tabs are covered. Entering Chapter 5, Fabrication, we see bolted connections and the K area welding limitations are discussed. Here, with Chapter 6, QC and QA, a very important table is given. Table 6-2 is very important for the QC and QA professionals. First, we see this table covers the inspections prior to welding, and yes, there is a table for during the welding also. Next is to check with the design professional for the proper category you are in, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. The third step is the actual inspection task that you're performing. With using a task column, we see the welder's responsibilities, then the QC and QA professional's responsibilities. Let's break down the QC and QA professional's responsibilities. Looking at the task of inspecting the shielded gas type, the QC professional would have a hold on the welder for further progress until this task has been checked and approved. And this is shown by the single check in the box. Next we move to measuring the root opening, and the QC professional would observe the welder checking the dimensions as work progresses. And here, with applying and verifying the minimum preheat that is required, the QC professional would check that the inspector is witnessing and reporting the proper actions. And to understand the table better, always review the footnotes or legend box if provided, and we see here the provided information for this table. First is the legend symbols used, and a single check stands for action that should take place. A double check means observation of the operation should take place. An H means a hold in action until an inspection action is done and reported. Lastly, with the legend is the O, which means observe the work being performed for the task requirements. Here we look at some key notes. First note, make sure we understand that the level of observation is not being specified here within this table and must satisfy the project requirements. Lastly, this note states, this table does not override any additional inspections that may be necessary by the project requirements. And to close part 1, we see it closes with 6 appendixes that cover both welding and welder qualifications, Sharpie V-notch toughness testing, flux core arc welding wire exposure limits, and non-destructive testing procedures. Let's move into part 2 of the FEMA document. Chapter 1, General, includes pre-job meetings and drawings. Now in Chapter 2, Contractor Qualification and Tasks, another valuable checklist is provided. Here we see the Fabricator's Evaluation Checklist, which is for the QC professional. Number 1 states the need for a written QC plan. Number 2 asks if the workmanship is checked throughout fabrication. Number 3 wants to know if the QC procedures are being followed. Number 4 asks if the inspection is in accordance with the procedures. Number 5, are records being kept for all inspections? Number 6, is there a final inspection for all finished assemblies? Number 7, are the inspectors trained and qualified for the work? Number 8, are the inspectors properly tooled? Number 9, is there proper communication with third-party inspection? Number 10, is there any conflict of interest within the production and QC professional? Number 11, does the QC professional have the proper authority within the company? Number 12, is there proper sequence for repair of rejected work? Now, moving back to keep reviewing the table of contents, we see Chapter 3, which covers the qualifying and practices for the QA agency. Moving on to Chapter 4, structural steel. This covers the items for material approval. Now we see Chapter 5, welding, which review items such as weld acceptance criteria and material control. And lastly, Chapter 6 is bolting. Now, for the AWS CWI inspector, bolting is not yet a required certification, but the knowledge of high tension bolting is a must for any steel QC or QA professional. And this chapter does cover many items from installation to inspection. To close out this document, we will review list of figures, and the main thing to notice is how it's broken into two different parts. Part 1, then Part 2. And here we see the list of tables, and it's also broken into two different parts. We have come to the end of Segment 4, and let's review the topics we have covered. First, we started with basic tools found in the code. We reviewed the scope of the code, key abbreviations and symbols, then alerted you to the index that you can use for finding information with speed and confidence. Secondly, we moved into the California Building Code, Chapters 17 and 22, where we review the table of contents and definitions, the duties of the QA professional, the QC responsibility, seismic testing requirements, seismic categories, then covered in depth the design, installation, and construction requirements for light gauge steel, and we closed with the testing of steel requirements that covered not only the steel itself, but bolts and the actual welded connections. And lastly, we reviewed FEMA 353 document, in which we learned the federal government's definition of both the QC and QA professionals, recommended practices, even for the welder. Then we closed with how high tension bolting knowledge and certification are important to any federal project. So the final steps of this segment is to read Part 2, Recommended Quality Assurance Guidelines, Chapter 1, General. Then complete questions. And if any questions arise, just email us at orangecountyinspections@yahoo.com. When finished, move to segment number 5.